Welcome to the year 1500. Tonight, we will wander softly through the world of medicine as it was then. A world caught between ancient tradition and the first stirrings of modern science. Before microscopes, before sterile tools, before anyone truly knew what caused disease. We'll explore the lives of healers and apothecaries, the strange remedies they trusted, and the quiet, candlelit rooms where hope and superstition intertwined. So settle in. Let the sound of history unfold slowly around you. Breathe deeply. Before we continue on this journey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you love listening history while going to sleep. You may leave a comment. What time are you watching? Now, imagine yourself in a century when medicine was as much art and faith as it was science. It's the year 1553. You're standing inside a small village house somewhere in Europe. The air feels heavy, thick with the smell of tallow candles and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. The floor creaks beneath your feet, and outside, rain taps gently against the thatched roof. A single candle flickers beside the bed, its weak light dancing over the pale face of a sick man. He's shivering, wrapped in wool, his breathing shallow. Beside him, a woman kneels, the local healer, or maybe just the neighbor who knows which plants to boil. She stirs something in a clay bowl, muttering quietly to herself. You can hear the spoon scrape the sides. It's not exactly what we'd call a hospital, but for this man, it's the only hope he has. Medicine back then was less about science and more about faith, luck, and maybe a bit of guesswork. You didn't go to a doctor, you went to someone. A wise woman, a barber, a priest who knew how to mix wine and herbs. Sometimes they helped, sometimes not so much. Still, people believed in healing. And that belief, that gentle, stubborn hope, was the light that kept the world going, candle by candle. The 1500s were a strange and beautiful time. Europe was waking up from the long sleep of the Middle Ages, and the world was changing fast. Sailors were returning from distant lands with spices, plants, and stories that no one quite believed. Artists painted the human body with new curiosity. Thinkers started to question old ideas, including the old ideas about what made people sick. But out in the countryside, far from the big cities and fancy universities, medicine still looked a lot like it had for centuries. People trusted what they could see, smell, and touch. A handful of herbs, a warm poultice, a prayer whispered in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, it worked. Not because of chemistry or anatomy, but because care itself can sometimes heal. Of course, not every cure was wise. Some were downright terrifying. If you had a fever, someone might suggest bloodletting, a little cut to balance your humors. If you had a headache, maybe they'd burn herbs that made the whole house smell like a witch's pantry. And if you were really unlucky, they might hand you a potion made of things you'd rather not identify in candlelight. Medicine in the 1500s was a curious mix of ancient wisdom, wild superstition, and brave experimentation. Every village had its remedies, and every healer had their secrets. Some used scripture and salt water. Others swore by crushed pearls, frog livers, and powdered unicorn horn, which, spoiler alert, was actually powdered narwhal tusk, sold by clever merchants from the north. It was a time when anything might work, because no one truly knew what did. The healer leans over the patient again. She places a damp cloth on his forehead. Outside, the rain keeps falling. There's no doctor to call, no pharmacy to visit. Just faith in God, in nature, in the idea that the world is full of hidden cures if you know where to look. In this little wooden room, medicine feels less like science and more like ritual. The candle burns low. The bowl of herbs steams softly. Someone murmurs a prayer in Latin, and the line between healing and hope becomes too thin to tell apart. It's easy to smile now, of course. We, with our pills, antibiotics, and air-conditioned hospitals, we might look back and think, how could they believe that? But remember, they didn't have anything else. No microscopes, no x-rays, no idea that invisible germs even existed. What they did have was courage, the courage to keep trying, even when the world made no sense. Imagine being a sick person in the 1500s. You'd lie in bed, feeling the fever rise, and the healer would come in with a little pouch of dried leaves. She'd whisper that the moon was in the wrong house, or that your blood had grown too hot. You might not understand it, but you'd believe her, because belief was the closest thing to medicine there was. And sometimes, that belief kept you alive long enough for your body to heal itself. There's something deeply human in that, a desire to help, a need to understand. a stubborn hope that tomorrow might be better. Medicine, in those days, wasn't just about bodies, it was about souls. Healing meant comfort, prayer, and presence. It meant sitting by someone's bed until morning, candlelight trembling against the dark. Every house, every village had its own little version of a place where people faced illness, not with machines or charts, but with quiet bravery. Where every cough was a mystery, every fever a challenge. And somehow, through all the uncertainty, life went on. The healer sets down her bowl. She adjusts the blanket. The candle flickers, and for a moment, the patient's breathing evens out. Maybe he'll recover, maybe he won't. Either way, someone will say they did everything they could, and that, in its own small way, was enough. As the night deepens, the house grows silent. Outside, the world keeps spinning, farmers dreaming of the morning, mothers humming softly to restless children, somewhere a church bell marking the hour. And in this quiet little room, the candle's light holds steady, a fragile, glowing thread between life and death, ignorance and discovery, superstition and science. This is where our story begins, a time when medicine was a mystery wrapped in faith, when every cure was a question, and every illness a lesson. Before hospitals, before antibiotics, before we understood what a germ even was, there was still care, there was still love, and there was still a small, stubborn light in the dark. That light, that little candle, would lead humanity forward, step by step, century by century, toward the strange, fascinating world of medicine in the 1500s. Sleep well, traveler. The story has only just begun. Long before thermometers and test tubes, before stethoscopes and blood tests, people had a very different idea of what made the human body tick. It all came down to one idea, the four humors. Now, the word humor didn't mean funny back then. It meant fluid. According to doctors and scholars from ancient Greece, and still believed deeply in the 1500s, your body was filled with four special liquids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If those four were in balance, you were healthy. If one of them got out of line, well, you might want to start writing your will. But truly, people believed it with all their hearts. This theory went all the way back to Hippocrates around 400 BC and was refined by Galen, the great Roman physician. For centuries, their words were treated almost like scripture. By the 1500s, doctors still studied their books as if the ink had been blessed by truth itself. Disagreeing with Galen wasn't just risky for your reputation, it was practically heresy. So, what were these humors, exactly? Let's take a slow walk through the body, 16th century style. First, blood, warm, lively, and full of spirit. It was linked to the element of air and the season of spring. If you had lots of blood, you were said to be cheerful and energetic, what they called sanguine. A sanguine person laughed easily, loved music, and enjoyed a good feast. Basically, the friend who brings wine and stories to every gathering. Next came phlegm, cool, moist, and calm. It was connected to water and the chill of winter. Too much phlegm, they said, made you slow, sleepy, and gentle. The phlegmatic type was the person sitting quietly by the fire while everyone else argued about politics. Not much bothered them. They just sipped their soup and waited for peace to return. Then there was yellow bile, linked to fire and summer heat. It was thought to make people ambitious, bold, and easily angered. The choleric type, too much yellow bile, and you might become short-tempered or rash. That one friend who yells at chess, yeah, probably too much bile. And finally, black bile, the most mysterious of all. It was tied to earth and autumn. Doctors said it made people serious, thoughtful, and sometimes sad. The melancholic personality. Too much of it, and you could fall into a deep, dark mood. A poet, staring at the rain, sighing about the meaning of life. Classic black bile behavior. These humors weren't just about personality though. They explained everything about health. Fever, too much blood, cough, too much phlegm, stomach pain, yellow bile's fault, depression, black bile, running wild again. There was a kind of comforting logic to it, a simple way to make sense of bodies that no one could see inside, and the treatments followed that same logic. If you had too much of one humor, you needed to get rid of it. That's where the famous cures came from: bloodletting, purging, vomiting, sweating, or changing your diet. Each patient was like a puzzle, and the doctor's job was to balance the inner fluids, to bring the body back to harmony. A doctor might say, "Your blood is too hot, you must be bled," and out came the leeches or the lancet, or your phlegm is sluggish, you must warm it with pepper and wine. Basically, medieval medicine was part science, part guessing, and part very creative storytelling. But strangely, it worked just enough of the time to keep the theory alive. When someone recovered, the healer said, "See, the humors are balanced again." When someone didn't, well, clearly, the humors were too far gone to save. In either case, the theory stayed safe. Even the colors of illness seemed to fit perfectly. Red cheeks, too much blood. Yellow skin, too much bile. Pale and cold, too much phlegm. Dark circles and sadness, obviously black bile. It was like medicine with a painter's palette for colors to explain the whole human condition. And so, for hundreds of years, the idea ruled Europe's medical world. Universities taught it. Doctors argued about it in Latin. Apothecaries made potions to cool or warm the humors. Even barbers followed it when they opened a vein for bloodletting. Every cough, sneeze, and stomachache could be traced back to one of those four mysterious fluids swirling invisibly inside you. It's easy for us to smile at that now, but there is something poetic about how they saw the human body, like a little universe in perfect balance. Air, water, fire, and earth, all mirrored inside us. They believed the same elements that built the stars and mountains also shaped our hearts and health. In a way, it was less about illness and more about harmony with nature itself. Of course, this belief had its darker side, because if your body was out of balance, someone had to fix it, often painfully. You might be bled until you fainted, or forced to drink a potion that purged you from both ends. If your fever wouldn't break, they might cool you by shaving your head and placing slices of cucumber on your scalp. Not the worst idea, but probably not in the medical textbooks today. It all sounds strange, but remember, they were doing their best with what they had. They didn't have microscopes or lab tests. All they had were centuries-old books, careful observation, and deep respect for the human body as part of nature's great pattern. And for its time, it was brilliant. The four humors gave doctors a way to think, to compare, to treat. It wasn't perfect, but it was the first step toward understanding that bodies followed rules, even if they guessed the wrong ones. Picture a student in 1500s Italy, sitting in a cold stone classroom. The professor reads from Galen, his voice echoing through the hall. The young student nods, taking notes by candlelight, believing every word. He'll go on to bleed his patients, prescribe herbs, and speak confidently of humors and elements. He'll save some lives, lose others, and never once doubt that he's following nature's plan. And maybe that's the most important part, the belief that there was a plan, that sickness wasn't random or cruel, but something that could be understood, even if imperfectly. The four humors gave comfort in a world full of mystery. So, the next time you catch a cold or feel a bit moody, be grateful you don't have a 16th century doctor nearby saying, "Ah, clearly your black bile is overflowing, fetch the leeches." No thank you. Still, for its time, the humor theory was a beautiful illusion, a bridge between superstition and science, between faith and curiosity. It taught people to look inward, to notice patterns, to ask questions. And from those questions, the next great steps in medicine would quietly begin. But for now, let's rest in that simpler world, a world where four little fluids ruled our fates, and balance was the key to health, harmony, and hope. In the world of the 1500s, sickness was never faced alone. There were always people, some trained, some not, who tried their best to mend broken bodies. These were the healers of the age, doctors in long robes, barbers with sharp razors, apothecaries surrounded by jars, and midwives who carried generations of quiet wisdom. They were the beating heart of 16th century medicine, each one working in their own way, guided by a mix of faith, tradition, and pure courage. ETS begin at the top of the healing ladder, the physicians. These were the elite of the medical world. They studied Latin, owned heavy books, and wore impressive black gowns that swished dramatically when they entered a room. A true physician might have trained at a university in Padua, Bologna, or Paris, studying the old masters, Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna. They didn't usually touch the patient themselves. That was considered undignified. Instead, they'd observe, ask careful questions, and then write a prescription, usually in Latin, which the apothecary would later mix into something that hopefully didn't kill you. A consultation might look something like this, and you lie in bed, weak from fever. The physician sits by your window, strokes his beard, and studies your face with deep thought. He asks how you sleep, what you eat, and most importantly, examines your urine. Yes, that was a big part of their job. They'd hold up the flask to the light, swirl it gently, and make a face of great importance. Then, after a long silence, he might say, "Too much yellow bile. Avoid hot foods. Try a little leeching." And just like that, you've received medical advice worth a small fortune. Physicians were respected, almost like priests of the body. But because their services were expensive, most common folk never saw one. In a village, the local healer was far more likely to be someone else entirely. Entered the barber surgeon. These were the hands-on healers, quite literally. They cut hair, trimmed beards, pulled teeth, set broken bones, and performed small surgeries. You could say they were part stylist, part dentist, part battlefield medic. Their red and white barber pole, which we still see today, came from this time. Red for blood, white for bandages. It's oddly cheerful for what it represents. A barber surgeon's shop was not a place for the faint of heart. Imagine the sound of metal tools clinking, the smell of iron and sweat, the steady drip of water into a wooden bucket. If you needed a tooth pulled, you sat in the same chair where someone had just been bled or stitched up. No anesthesia, no sterilization, no music to distract you. Just grit your teeth and hope he grabs the right one. But here's the thing, barber surgeons were practical. They learned by doing, not by reading, and many of them became surprisingly skilled. In towns and on battlefields, when someone was hurt, it was the barber surgeon who saved lives, not the fancy physician with his Latin notes. So if you ever time travel back to the 1500s and slice your hand open, skip the scholar and find the barber, then we have the apothecaries. If the physician was the thinker and the barber surgeon the doer, the apothecary was the mixer. These were the pharmacists of the 1500s, men who knew their herbs, minerals, and odd ingredients better than anyone. Their shops smelled of spice and mystery, shelves lined with glass jars, dried flowers, ground powders, and maybe a dried lizard or two for good measure. Apothecaries prepared medicines from ingredients like cinnamon, camphor, mercury, and honey. They ground, boiled, and stirred, creating potions with names that sounded half magical, half dangerous. If you came in with a cough, they might hand you syrup of poppy for comfort. If you couldn't sleep, maybe valerian root or a pinch of opium. They were part scientist, part cook, and a little bit magician. Some apothecaries also acted as unofficial doctors, giving advice, diagnosing, and treating patients themselves. They were trusted members of the community, though always careful not to seem too confident, lest the local physicians accuse them of pretending to knowledge above their station. You had to walk a fine line between helpful and heretical back then. And then, perhaps the most underappreciated of all, the midwives and local healers. These were often women, passed down knowledge from mother to daughter. They knew herbs that eased pain, teas that helped sleep, and rituals that comforted the frightened. They delivered babies, comforted the dying, and treated everyday aches that no physician would bother with. They worked from instinct and experience, not from books. In small villages, these women were the real doctors, though they were rarely called that. They were healers, herb wives, or sometimes, if things went wrong, accused of being witches. It was a dangerous kind of wisdom to have. A woman who could heal could also, in the wrong eyes, be blamed for harm. Yet they kept healing, quietly, bravely, in candlelit cottages, with hands that knew both birth and death. Their remedies were often gentle and surprisingly effective. Chamomile for pain, honey for wounds, willow bark for fever. Long before laboratories proved it, they already knew nature had its own kind of science. Together, these healers, the physician, the barber surgeon, the apothecary, and the midwife, formed the patchwork of medicine in the 1500s. Each one filled a role the others couldn't. The physician had the theory, the barber surgeon had the skill, the apothecary had the ingredients, and the midwife had the heart. It wasn't a perfect system, far from it. But somehow, between them all, humanity survived fevers, wounds, childbirth, and plague. Not because they understood everything, but because they refused to stop trying. Imagine a small town at sunset. The apothecary closes his shutters. The barber sharpens his blades for the next day. The physician writes notes by candlelight. And somewhere, a midwife walks home beneath the stars. Different lives, different tools, but the same purpose. To keep people alive in a world that didn't always make sense. Medicine wasn't yet science. It was service, and it was care. It was the steady hand in the dark, the whispered prayer over a feverish child, the comfort of knowing someone was trying to help. And though the four humors ruled their minds, something far deeper ruled their hearts, the quiet courage to heal, even when the world offered no guarantees. The apothecary's shop was one of the most enchanting places in any 16th century town. Step through its low wooden doorway, and you'd be greeted by a warm, fragrant air that seemed to hum with mystery. Every surface told a story: shelves lined with glass jars, earthen pots, and paper-wrapped bundles, each label written in curling Latin script: pulvis, cinamomi, unguentum, rosarum, tinctura, opi. The apothecary himself, often in a long coat dusted with powder, would be grinding something in a mortar. The rhythmic tap-tap of the pestle was as steady as a heartbeat. Apothecaries were the quiet chemists of their time, long before the word pharmacist existed. They understood plants and minerals the way a painter understands color. Their shelves held the treasures of distant lands: nutmeg from the Spice Islands, frankincense from Arabia, pepper from India, and cinnamon from Ceylon. These were not just ingredients for medicine. They were the very proof of how wide the world had become. To walk into a good apothecary's shop in the 1500s was to step into the crossroads of science, superstition, and trade. Every jar and bottle was part of a global story. A pinch of rhubarb from China might sit next to saltpeter from the Middle East. Dried orange peel from Spain might share a shelf with powdered coral from Italy. And behind the counter stood the apothecary, equal parts healer, businessman, and storyteller. He'd listen carefully to your symptoms. You might say, "I've a heaviness in my chest," or "My sleep is poor." He'd nod wisely, pull a few jars from the shelf, and begin to mix. The process looked simple: a little of this, a pinch of that, but it was guided by years of observation and an intuitive sense of balance. Honey might be added to sweeten a bitter rosewater could soothe both heart and spirit. Rosewater could soothe both heart and spirit, and perhaps a drop of opium to quiet the pain. A spoonful of sugar may not have been invented yet, but the apothecary already knew that a pleasant taste could make any cure easier to swallow. The tools of the trade were beautiful in their simplicity: mortar and pestles made of marble or brass, scales with delicate weights shaped like coins, glass alembics for distilling, and parchment funnels for straining. Glass alembics for distilling, and parchment funnels for straining. A good apothecary's counter looked less like a doctor's office and more like an alchemist's dream, and indeed, the line between apothecary and alchemist was very thin. Many apothecaries dabbled in alchemy, distilling essences, experimenting with metals, trying to purify substances, or even to create the legendary elixir of life. They saw no contradiction between healing the body and seeking the secrets of nature to them. Everything from herbs to mercury was part of a divine mystery waiting to be understood. But an apothecary's world wasn't tea, all shimmering glass and exotic spices. It also carried responsibility. A mistake in dosage could mean disaster, and because most ingredients were expensive, there was always the temptation to substitute something cheaper. Regulations were strict. City guilds and councils often inspected apothecaries to ensure honesty and quality. A false mixture could lead not just to illness, but to the ruin of one's reputation. Still, many apothecaries enjoyed a kind of quiet fame. They were respected, even loved, by their communities. People came not only for medicine, but for advice, for a listening ear and a word of comfort. In an age when doctors were distant and disease mysterious, the apothecary's shop felt human and close. On a quiet evening, after closing time, you might find the apothecary sitting by his candlelight, writing recipes into a worn notebook, his handwriting looping carefully, naming plants and their virtues: chamomile for calm, rue for cramps, sage for memory, foxglove to be used only with caution. Each entry was a whisper of knowledge gathered through centuries. It's humbling to think many of those old remedies weren't entirely wrong. Chamomile truly does soothe. Willow bark really eases pain. It contains salicin, a natural form of aspirin. Even the idea of balancing the body's elements, though wrapped in old superstition, hinted at the truth of chemical balance and internal health. In their quiet way, apothecaries bridged the ancient and the modern. They stood at the edge of the old world, the one ruled by humors and magic, and peered into the dawn of science. Without quite knowing it, some became scholars, publishing herbals books filled with drawings and notes on plants. One famous English apothecary, Nicholas Culpeper, would later translate the secrets of medicine into the language of ordinary people. He called out the arrogance of physicians and opened the world of healing to everyone who could read. It was an act both revolutionary and compassionate, and it all began in shops just like this one, dusty, fragrant, and alive with curiosity. Imagine for a moment that you're there. The wooden floor creaks under your boots, the air smells of sage, dried lavender, and warm beeswax. The apothecary looks up from his work and smiles politely. He doesn't rush. He finishes grinding a little powder, ties it neatly in paper, and seals it with red wax. He hands it to you with quiet assurance. A mixture for sleep, perhaps, or for a troubled stomach. His eyes are tired but kind. He's been mixing remedies all day, yet his patience seems endless. You pay a few coins and thank him. He bows slightly, and you step out into the cool night. The sound of his mortar fades behind you, steady and rhythmic, the heartbeat of medicine itself. The apothecary's shop was more than a place of medicine, and it was a sanctuary of curiosity, compassion, and hope. In a world where disease could strike without warning, it offered something precious, the feeling that someone, somewhere, was doing their best to understand. And though centuries have passed, and the jars have turned to glass bottles with barcodes, a part of that spirit still lingers in every modern pharmacy in the careful mixing. The gentle explanations, the simple human act of trying to make someone feel better. Next, we'll step away from the shop and into the darker corners of medicine, where sickness spread through cities and doctors struggled against enemies they couldn't yet see. Plague, superstition, and courage, all waiting in the next chapter. In the 1500s, if you weren't feeling well, a fever, a headache, a touch of melancholy, there was a treatment almost everyone agreed on. In the 1500s, if you weren't feeling well, a fever, a headache, a touch of melancholy, there was a treatment almost everyone agreed on. It was simple, direct, and well, a little bit terrifying. They would take some of your blood, and this was called bloodletting, and it was one of the most common medical practices in the world. It might sound strange now, but back then, it made perfect sense, at least according to the best knowledge they had. Medicine in the 16th century was built on the belief in the four humors, the idea that your body was like a delicate stew, balanced between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If one ingredient got out of hand, everything could go wrong. Too much blood. You'd be feverish, restless, and red-faced. So the obvious answer to them was to remove some. It's the medical version of opening a window to let the bad air out. Except the window was your arm. The process was usually quick, though not painless. A lancet, a small blade, or even a sharpened piece of flint was used to make a tiny cut, usually on the forearm. A bowl sat below to catch the dark stream. Sometimes, leeches were placed on the skin instead, little, glossy creatures that did the work, slowly, rhythmically, and with unnerving efficiency. Leeches were especially popular because they seemed tidy. They were used on delicate patients, women, and even the sickly rich who didn't want to see blood spill. Doctors carried them in small glass jars filled with water, and a good set of leeches was worth quite a bit. They were, in their own way, the 16th century version of medical equipment, reusable, portable, and organic. Though of course, no one asked the leeches how they felt about it. The goal was always balanced. Doctors believed that illness was a kind of internal storm. Too much heat, too much wetness, too much of one humor throwing everything else into chaos. Doctors believed that illness was a kind of internal storm. Too much heat, too much wetness, too much of one humor throwing everything else into chaos, and bloodletting was their way of calming the storm. They thought of it as letting the body breathe. Sometimes, a doctor would even consult an astrological chart before deciding which vein to open. If Mars was in a fiery position, for example, they might choose a different arm. Because, naturally, you wouldn't want to disturb the wrong cosmic balance while trying to fix your own. There's something oddly poetic about it. How the heavens and the human body were once thought to mirror each other, each pulse and planet connected, in a grand invisible rhythm, but still, bloodletting was far from gentle. For some patients, it worked perhaps by coincidence, perhaps by placebo, or maybe because losing a little blood did lower fevers slightly. But for others, especially the weak and malnourished, it could be deadly. Yet the practice persisted for centuries, and even kings and queens endured it. Henry VIII, for instance, was a great believer in bloodletting, though one suspects it did him more harm than good. The setting was often simple. Imagine a small wooden room with a single chair in the center. A patient sits, pale and nervous, and the barber surgeon, sleeves rolled up, unwraps his tools. He places a brass bowl beneath the arm, hums quietly, and goes to work. There's a faint metallic smell, a trickle of warmth, and then a kind of quiet relief. The patient relaxes, light-headed but oddly calm, and perhaps they think it's working, and maybe, in a strange way, it was. Not medically, perhaps, but psychologically. When you live in a world where illness is mysterious and terrifying, doing something, anything, feels better than doing nothing. And bloodletting was, above all, something you could do. It also had its rituals. Doctors would debate how much blood to take: a small amount for a mild fever, a larger bowl for a stubborn illness. Some would even mark the bowl to measure the correct volume. The color and thickness of the blood were carefully observed. Too dark, and they'd say the humor was imbalanced; too thin, and perhaps the patient lacked vitality. There's a kind of heartbreaking logic to it. They were trying, truly trying, to read the language of the body, to find patterns, to make sense of pain. They didn't have microscopes or germ theory, but they had observation, courage, and faith in the idea that the body could be understood. Of course, not everyone trusted the doctors in villages. Local healers sometimes warned against too much bleeding. Old women who knew herbs and poultices would whisper, "Let the body rest, don't drain its strength." And sometimes, those voices of caution were the wisest of all. It's easy, from the comfort of our modern world, to smile at their mistakes. But when you think about it, their reasoning wasn't all that different from ours. They believed the body had to stay in balance, and today, we still talk about balance, though we use different words. Homeostasis, hydration, circulation, chemistry. The tools have changed. The language has changed, but the desire to restore harmony remains the same. By the late 1500s, a few brave voices began to question the practice. New anatomists and observers noticed that patients often grew weaker after bleeding. Surgeons like Ambroise Paré began to suggest gentler methods: rest, diet, and cleanliness. The world was slowly, almost sleepily, waking up from the long dream of humors. But for most people, the old ways still held comfort. And as long as people believed in imbalance, there would always be someone ready to set it right with a bowl, a blade, and a steady hand. With a bowl, a blade, and a steady hand. Imagine now, the fire has burned low. The surgeon's tools are clean and resting outside. The night air is cool and still. Somewhere in the village, a patient lies under blankets, pale but hopeful. The bleeding has stopped. The body, for better or worse, has found its peace for the night, and maybe that's all they ever really wanted. Not perfection, not certainty, just a little peace. Next, we'll move into the world of the barber surgeon's chair, where knives flashed, saws turned, and medicine became a test of courage. A calm exploration of what it meant to face surgery before anesthesia and before the world knew the meaning of sterile. It was simple, direct, and well, a little bit terrifying. They would take some of your blood. This was called bloodletting, and it was one of the most common medical practices in the world. It might sound strange now, but back then, it made perfect sense, at least according to the best knowledge they had. Medicine in the 16th century was built on the belief in the four humors, the idea that your body was like a delicate stew, balanced between blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If one ingredient got out of hand, everything could go wrong. Too much blood, you'd be feverish, restless, and red-faced. So the obvious answer to them was to remove some. It's the medical version of opening a window to let the bad air out, except the window was your arm. It's the medical version of opening a window to let the bad air out, except the window was your arm. The process was usually quick, though not painless. A lancet, a small blade, or even a sharpened piece of flint was used to make a tiny cut, usually on the forearm. A bowl sat below to catch the dark stream. Sometimes, leeches were placed on the skin instead, little, glossy creatures that did the work slowly, rhythmically, and with unnerving efficiency. Leeches were especially popular because they seemed tidy. They were used on delicate patients, women, and even the sickly rich who didn't want to see blood spill. Doctors carried them in small glass jars filled with water, and a good set of leeches was worth quite a bit. They were, in their own way, the 16th century version of medical equipment, reusable, portable, and organic. Though of course, no one asked the leeches how they felt about it. The goal was always balance. Doctors believed that illness was a kind of internal storm. Too much heat, too much wetness, too much of one humor throwing everything else into chaos. Bloodletting was their way of calming the storm. They thought of it as letting the body breathe. Sometimes, a doctor would even consult an astrological chart before deciding which vein to open. If Mars was in a fiery position, for example, they might choose a different arm. Because, naturally, you wouldn't want to disturb the wrong cosmic balance while trying to fix your own. There's something oddly poetic about it, how the heavens and the human body were once thought to mirror each other, each pulse and planet connected in a grand invisible rhythm. Still, bloodletting was far from gentle. For some patients, it worked, perhaps by coincidence, perhaps by placebo, or maybe because losing a little blood did lower fevers slightly. But for others, especially the weak and malnourished, it could be deadly. Yet the practice persisted for centuries, and even kings and queens endured it. Henry VIII, for instance, was a great believer in bloodletting, though one suspects it did him more harm than good. The setting was often simple. Imagine a small wooden room with a single chair in the center. A patient sits, pale and nervous. The barber surgeon, sleeves rolled up, unwraps his tools. He places a brass bowl beneath the arm, hums quietly, and goes to work. There's a faint metallic smell, a trickle of warmth, and then a kind of quiet relief. The patient relaxes, light-headed, but oddly calm, and perhaps, they think, it's working. And maybe, in a strange way, it was not medically, perhaps, but psychologically. When you live in a world where illness is mysterious and terrifying, doing something, anything, feels better than doing nothing, and bloodletting was, above all, something you could do. It also had its rituals. Doctors would debate how much blood to take. A small amount for a mild fever, a larger bowl for a stubborn illness. Some would even mark the bowl to measure the correct volume. The color and thickness of the blood were carefully observed to dark, and they'd say the humor was imbalanced, too thin. And perhaps the patient lacked vitality, and there's a kind of heartbreaking logic to it. They were trying, truly trying, to read the language of the body, to find patterns, to make sense of pain. They didn't have microscopes or germ theory, but they had observation, courage, and faith in the idea that the body could be understood. Of course, not everyone trusted the doctors. In villages, local healers sometimes warned against too much bleeding. Old women who knew herbs and poultices would whisper, "Let the body rest. Don't drain its strength." And sometimes, those voices of caution were the wisest of all. It's easy, from the comfort of our modern world, to smile at their mistakes. But when you think about it, their reasoning wasn't all that different from ours. They believed the body had to stay in balance, and today, we still talk about balance, though we use different words. Homeostasis, hydration, circulation, chemistry. The tools have changed. The language has changed, but the desire to restore harmony remains the same. By the late 1500s, a few brave voices began to question the practice. New anatomists and observers noticed that patients often grew weaker after bleeding. Surgeons like Ambroise Pare began to suggest gentler methods: rest, diet, and cleanliness. The world was slowly, almost sleepily, waking up from the long dream of humors. But for most people, the old ways still held comfort. And as long as people believed in imbalance, there would always be someone ready to set it right, with a bowl, a blade, and a steady hand. Imagine now, the fire has burned low. The surgeon's tools are clean and resting. Outside, the night air is cool and still. Somewhere in the village, a patient lies under blankets, pale but hopeful. The bleeding has stopped. The body, for better or worse, has found its peace for the night, and maybe that's all they ever really wanted. Not perfection, not certainty, just a little peace. Next, we'll move into the world of the barber surgeon's chair, where knives flashed, saws turned, and medicine became a test of courage. A calm exploration of what it meant to face surgery before anesthesia, and before the world knew the meaning of sterile. Before the hum of machines, before the clean scent of antiseptic and the comfort of anesthesia, there was the sound of saws, the quiet murmur of prayers, and courage, a very human, trembling kind of courage. In the 1500s, surgery was a brutal necessity. It wasn't elegant, and it certainly wasn't painless. It was, in many ways, a race between the surgeon's skill and the patient's endurance. The operating room, if you could call it that, was often just a wooden chair in a shop or a monastery. The operating table might have been a sturdy bench, or even the patient's own bed. There were no sterile gloves, no disinfected tools, and no anesthesia to dull the pain. And yet, people still came, desperate for relief from wounds, infections, or worse. The barber surgeon was the one you called. He was part craftsman, part healer, part warrior. His red and white striped pole, still the symbol of barbers today, told the story of his trade. Red for blood, white for bandages, the pole itself representing the stick patients gripped during bloodletting or surgery. He wasn't a doctor in the learned sense. Doctors studied in universities, wrote in Latin, and preferred to diagnose rather than to cut. Barber surgeons, on the other hand, worked with their hands, cutting hair one day, cutting flesh the next. It was a messy, dangerous business, but someone had to do it. A patient would sit in the surgeon's chair, often surrounded by a few assistants, strong men whose job was simple: to hold the patient still. The surgeon would offer a piece of leather to bite down on. Sometimes, a small cup of wine or brandy helped steady the nerves. Then, with tools that looked more suited to a blacksmith than a healer, knives, clamps, saws, and cautery irons, the operation would begin. Imagine that moment, the world narrowing to the sound of breathing, the flicker of firelight glinting off metal, the surgeon moving quickly, his hands sure, his face calm. Every second mattered. Amputations were the most common operations, usually after battlefield injuries or gangrene. The surgeon's goal was speed. A skilled one could remove a limb in under 2 minutes. Assistants would tie off the patient's arms or legs with leather straps to slow the bleeding. Then came the cautery iron, heated until it glowed, pressed firmly against the stump to seal the wound. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. It was horrific, but it was survival. And through it all, the patient might cry out, or whisper prayers, or fall silent from the shock. Some survived, some didn't. Infection was an invisible enemy they couldn't yet understand. Wounds were washed with wine or vinegar, both thought to cleanse, and then wrapped in linen bandages, sometimes coated in honey or resin to keep out the air. It's easy to imagine the brutality, but what's harder to see, and just as real, is the quiet compassion that lived behind it. These surgeons weren't monsters. They did what they could with what they had. Their hands may have been rough, but their intent was healing, and they had their tricks, too. Some used music to distract patients, a small drum, a lute, even a chant. Some whispered soothing words, telling stories as they worked. Others worked outdoors, where the sound of birds and wind could hide the pain for a moment. It wasn't medicine by science. It was medicine by empathy. Among them, a few began to rise above mere craft. Ambroise Père, a French barber surgeon, changed everything. He served on battlefields and saw horrors most men couldn't imagine. One day, when he ran out of boiling oil, the standard treatment for sealing gunshot wounds, he used a gentler balm instead, a mixture of egg yolk, rose oil, and turpentine. The next morning, he found his patients who'd received the balm were resting peacefully, while those treated with oil were in agony. Père wrote later, quietly and humbly, "I dressed him, and God healed him." It was a small moment, but a turning point. It showed that care and observation could matter more than tradition or cruelty. By the mid-1500s, new tools were being crafted, finer knives, hinged clamps, and even rudimentary forceps. But surgery was still a last resort. If you had a choice between living with a problem or facing the knife, most people chose to live with it. Still, the world was changing. Anatomists were studying the human body in ways no one had dared before. Dissections, once forbidden, were now being performed in universities, allowing surgeons to truly understand what lay beneath the skin. Each discovery brought them closer to the medicine we know today, though they didn't yet realize it. There's something profoundly human in all of this. The idea that progress often begins not with certainty, but with necessity. These men and women, rough, brave, compassionate, and flawed, paved the way for the science that would one day make surgery safe, clean, and nearly painless. Imagine now the end of a long day. The surgeon's tools are cleaned, or as clean as they can be. The floorboards are scrubbed with salt and wine. The patient, pale but alive, rests by a fire. Outside, the night is calm. The stars above shine with the same steady light they always have. Indifferent yet comforting, as if whispering you endured. You survived. In the quiet after pain, there is peace and the faint promise of a gentler world to come. Next we'll step into that world of fear and faith, where invisible enemies swept through streets and cities, and the figure of the plague doctor appeared in his strange, bird-like mask, a haunting chapter in the story of medicine and of human resilience. It begins with silence. the kind that feels heavy, the kind that makes the air itself uneasy. In the early 1500s, Europe had not yet escaped its darkest shadow, the Black Death. Though its most catastrophic wave had passed in the 14th century, the plague returned again and again, quietly, unpredictably, like a ghost that refused to rest. Cities grew anxious at the first whisper of sickness. A cough, a fever, a neighbor who didn't open their shutters that morning. Rumors spread faster than the disease itself. And soon, the dreaded carts would roll through the streets once more, their wheels creaking beneath the weight of the dead. Men with cloths tied over their mouths would call out, "Bring out your dead," and people would obey, because fear was the only thing more contagious than the plague. But in that sea of terror, there emerged a strange figure, a symbol both of hope and horror, the plague doctor, clad head to toe in a long waxed coat, gloves, boots, and a broad-brimmed hat. His most striking feature was the mask, a long, curved beak, like that of a great white bird. Inside the beak, herbs and flowers were packed, lavender, mint, camphor, and cloves, meant to filter the miasma, the poisonous air thought to carry disease. To the people of the 1500s, this mask was both comfort and nightmare. Comfort, because it meant someone had come to help. Nightmare, because it meant the plague was near. The plague doctor was not a healer in the way we might imagine. He was part physician, part recorder, part witness. He moved from house to house, marking the sick, comforting the dying, and writing down what he saw so that others might one day learn. One account, from the city of Venice, describes the doctor's task like this: to examine the infected, to note their symptoms, to prescribe what little might be done, and to pray for the mercy of God. There were no real cures, only attempts to ease pain, bloodletting, burning herbs to purify the air, carrying charms or placing coins in vinegar to wash away corruption. And yet, amidst all this, people still hoped. They prayed, they cared for one another, even when afraid. Imagine the sound of a knock on a wooden door, a pause, then the slow creak as it opens, and there, framed in the dim light, stands the plague doctor, his eyes hidden behind glass lenses, his breath muffled through the beak. He asks gently, "Who here is ill?" And the family, trembling, points to a small figure in bed. He kneels, he listens, he writes. Sometimes he whispers a prayer, sometimes he can do nothing at all. And when he rises, he leaves behind both sorrow and gratitude, because even in despair, someone came. Soft background, faint chanting of monks, echoing footsteps in a stone corridor. Cities responded to the plague with desperate order. Guards closed the gates, markets emptied, church bells tolled constantly. In some towns, red crosses were painted on doors, a silent mark, "Lord, have mercy." Plague houses were sealed shut, sometimes with whole families inside. And yet, in monasteries and small corners of the world, men and women of faith tended to the dying. Knowing they might not see another dawn, they wrote letters, journals, and poems, not of fear, but of endurance. Softly, with calm reverence, it is in these writings that we hear something remarkable, a quiet understanding of impermanence. They began to see life not as something guaranteed, but as something precious, fragile, and fleeting. One friar wrote during the 1523 outbreak in Florence, "We bury the dead not with despair, but with love. Each soul returns to the earth from which it came, and from that earth others shall rise again." Through tragedy, medicine learned, slowly, painfully. Doctors began to keep detailed records of symptoms and patterns. They noted that the disease spread more quickly in crowded places and less in clean, well-ventilated ones. Without realizing it, they were beginning to understand contagion, the invisible thread that connects one life to another. They also began to separate the sick from the healthy, a practice that became known as quarantine. The word itself comes from kranagiorni, 40 days the period ships were made to wait before passengers could disembark in cities like Venice or Dubrovnik. It was a simple idea, born of fear, but it saved countless lives. From this darkness, a light began to flicker. The plague doctor's strange costume, the quarantines, the meticulous notes, all of it was part of the first fragile framework of public health. The bird-like figure, so eerie in his black robes, wasn't just a symbol of death. He was also a symbol of our determination to face it, to understand it, to protect one another from it. The centuries that followed would bring better tools, better understanding, and eventually a new kind of medicine, one based on observation, evidence, and compassion. But in this moment, in the flickering candlelight of a sick room, what mattered most was humanity itself, a gentle hand, a whispered blessing, a candle burning in the dark. The plague came and went, as all storms do, but it left behind a deeper sense of empathy, the knowledge that, in the face of fear, our greatest strength is not power or wealth, but kindness. Next, we'll move into the quieter dawn of healing, the 1600s and 1700s, where science begins to awaken fully, where reason, anatomy, and invention finally start to challenge superstition and fear. A world still rough around the edges, but beginning to dream of hospitals, sanitation, and light. The world smells of earth again. The storm of plague has passed for now, and life, fragile but persistent, begins to return. Imagine walking through a small 16th century village garden, the kind kept behind a thatched cottage or monastery wall. The air is warm and full of scent: lavender, sage, thyme, mint, and rosemary. Each plant has a purpose, each leaf a secret. In this quieter corner of history, medicine looks a little less like bleeding bowls and masks, and a little more like soil beneath the fingernails. This is where healing lives, in herbs, roots, and remedies passed from hand to hand, from mother to daughter, from one old healer to the next. Before the word pharmacy ever existed, there was the herb garden, and before the scientist's laboratory, there was the kitchen table with bundles of drying leaves hanging from the rafters, and a mortar and pestle resting nearby, its bowls smooth from years of use. Here, a little comfrey is crushed into a poultice for a sprained ankle, a bit of valerian steeped in warm water for a restless night, honey spread over a cut to keep it clean, and a whisper of rosemary burned to clear bad air. To our modern ears, it sounds quaint, almost magical. But in truth, much of this early knowledge worked. Not because of spells or stars, but because people learned by watching, by trying, by remembering. If your neighbor's cough eased after drinking thyme tea, you made a note of it. Maybe not in a book, but in memory, in tradition. And that, really, is what medicine was in the countryside. A blend of faith, luck, and careful observation. Monasteries played a huge role too. Behind their stone walls, monks tended to lush herb gardens, each bed labeled with neat wooden markers: sage for digestion, fennel for the eyes, poppy for pain. The monks wrote down their recipes in thick hand-copied books, called herbals, part science, part poetry. One might say, rosemary quickens the spirit. Lavender comforted the head, simple, clear, and somehow comforting. These manuals traveled slowly across Europe, copied, traded, translated, until even apothecaries in busy cities relied on them. If you walked into an apothecary's shop in 1550, you'd see those same herbs, now mixed with imported wonders from abroad: nutmeg from the Spice Islands, myrrh from Arabia, and even powdered pearls from Venice. The world was growing wider, and so was its medicine. But let's not forget the quiet healers, the wise women of villages and small towns. They were rarely educated in Latin. They didn't wear robes or belong to universities. Yet they were the ones people came to first, for fevers, for childbirth, for heartbreak. They knew how to soothe pain, when to use heat or cold, which plants calmed the stomach, and which ones were better left untouched. They were midwives, herbalists, caretakers, and sometimes they were called witches, not because they did harm, but because what they knew seemed mysterious. And perhaps, in a way, it was. When a woman whispered over a feverish child, mixed herbs with honey, and wrapped it in cloth, she was practicing both medicine and mercy. The two have always gone hand in hand. There's something deeply human about the act of healing, about bending over someone in pain and trying, however simply, to help. Even when knowledge was thin, compassion was rich. And though we might smile now at the image of sage tea for melancholy, science would later confirm that many of these plants did exactly what their gatherers claimed. Willow bark, for example, was brewed for pain, and centuries later it would give birth to aspirin. Foxglove, used for weak hearts, would become digitalis, a powerful heart medicine. And poppy sap, gathered from delicate white flowers, would evolve into the first painkillers. It's humbling, isn't it, that what began as whispers in a village garden would one day become the foundation of modern pharmacology. But for the people of the 1500s, it wasn't about science. It was about survival, about caring for each other with what nature offered. In a way, it was a form of prayer, a conversation with the earth itself. Picture this: A healer sits beside the hearth at night, a bowl of herbs in her lap. She hums softly as she grinds them together, the fire painting gold light on her hands. Her patient, wrapped in blankets, breathes easier as the scent of lavender fills the air. Outside, the wind is cold. Inside, the world feels safe. The 1500s were full of superstition, yes, but they were also full of heart. Every remedy, every charm, was an act of care in a fragile world. And sometimes, that care was enough. Next, we lift our gaze from the garden to the heavens, to a time when people believed their health was written in the stars. To a time when people believed their health was written in the stars. When doctors consulted the moon and planets before treating the body. We'll step beneath the night sky and see how the stars once guided medicine. Look up. The stars shimmer above a quiet 16th century town, their light silvering the rooftops and cobblestones somewhere. A candle flickers in the upper window of a healer's home inside. A man sits at a wooden desk, quill in hand. The stars shimmer above a quiet 16th century town, their light silvering the rooftops and cobblestones. Somewhere, a candle flickers in the upper window of a healer's home, his eyes moving between a parchment chart and the open sky beyond. He is not stargazing for beauty, he is stargazing for medicine, because in the 1500s, the heavens and the body were believed to move in rhythm, two halves of the same great clock, each gear turning the other. It sounds strange now, doesn't it? That doctors once treated illness by studying the movements of the moon and planets. But in those days, astrology and medicine were sisters, inseparable, mysterious, and, in their own way, comforting. Physicians carried zodiac charts beside their medical texts. They knew that Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms and lungs, and so on down to Pisces at the feet. The human body, they said, was a mirror of the cosmos. When the stars fell out of harmony, so did flesh and blood. Before a doctor performed bloodletting, he consulted the stars. He checked whether the moon was waxing or waning, whether Mars, the planet of heat and courage, was in an unlucky place. If the heavens warned against it, the patient might wait another day. Even simple remedies were timed carefully, herbs gathered when Venus was bright, ointments mixed under a kind moon. In short, the 1500s were full of celestial scheduling. But there was logic in it, in a way. People saw patterns, the tide pulling with the moon, the seasons changing with the sun, life itself moving in cycles. Why shouldn't our bodies do the same? And there was something comforting about believing that illness had meaning, that the pain in your chest, the fever, the melancholy, were not random cruelties but signs written in the stars. If the planets could wound, perhaps they could also heal. Astrological medicine came from ancient roots, from Greek, Arab, and medieval scholars who saw the universe as one great organism. Galen, Avicenna, Ptolemy, names whispered like prayers in candlelit universities. Their teachings said the same thing. To heal the body, one must first understand the heavens. Sound of quills scratching on parchment. A physician in the 1500s might draw your horoscope before giving you medicine. He would note the hour you were born, the alignment of Jupiter and Saturn, and from that, decide whether to purge, to bleed, or to rest. It wasn't science as we know it, but it was careful, detailed, even tender, a kind of faith wrapped in mathematics. In some towns, entire calendars were printed almanacs, showing lucky and unlucky days for healing. Farmers used them for planting crops. Doctors used them for tending bodies. Each page filled with tiny stars, curving lines, and Latin notes. You can almost imagine the sound of one being read aloud in a candlelit. For fevers, let blood when the moon is in Aries. For melancholy, avoid the hour of Mars. For wounds, pray when the moon is new, calmly, with gentle amusement. It may sound poetic, and it was, but for them, this poetry was survival. And sometimes, even coincidence was enough to give hope. When the stars promised healing, people rested easier, and that, in itself, can do wonders. Still, not everyone agreed. Andreas Vesalius, the anatomist, for all his rebellion, could not quite let go of the stars. He believed each plant and mineral carried a celestial signature, a kind of cosmic fingerprint. Gold, he said, held the power of the sun. Silver, the calm of the moon. Iron, the strength of Mars. To him, the universe was a pharmacy, and God was the great apothecary. For all their errors, there was beauty in their vision, a belief that life, in all its mystery, was connected, that the stars above and the pulse in our wrist beat to the same rhythm. By the late 1500s, astrology's grip on medicine began to loosen. New discoveries, new instruments, and the quiet rise of experimentation slowly dimmed its authority. But even now, 5 centuries later, the zodiac symbols on old hospital emblems, the moon phases marked in almanacs, the lingering belief that a bad moon can bring a bad night. Maybe there's a reason we still look to the sky when we're sick, still whisper, "Please, let tomorrow be better." The stars remind us that the world is vast, and that our troubles, however heavy, are part of something bigger, something ancient, something endlessly turning. So tonight, as the stars keep their slow watch overhead, remember how long humanity has looked upward for comfort, not just for answers, but for peace. Next, we'll return from the heavens to the earth, to the early hospitals, where faith, charity, and human touch became medicine's quiet companions. The night is still, and through a narrow window, moonlight spills into a long stone corridor. The air smells faintly of beeswax and herbs. Candles flicker along the walls, their small flames reflecting in bowls of water left by the door. You are standing in a hospital, though not the kind you might imagine. In the 1500s, hospitals were not places of science or surgery. They were sanctuaries, half home, half chapel, where the poor, the sick, and the dying came seeking care, food, or simply company. The word hospital itself comes from hospice, meaning guest or host. To be admitted wasn't just to be treated, it was to be welcomed. Many were run by the church, stone buildings attached to monasteries or cathedrals, funded by wealthy patrons, who hoped their donations might earn them favor in heaven. Inside, the atmosphere was simple, almost sacred. Long rows of beds lined up beneath vaulted ceilings, each covered with coarse linen sheets. Above every bed hung a small crucifix, and at the far end of the hall, a candle burned before an altar. Here, medicine met mercy. The nuns, the monks, the brothers of charity. They were the nurses, the caregivers, the hands that washed the fevered brow and whispered prayers through the night. They had few medicines, a little vinegar for cleaning wounds, some honey to soothe a sore throat, a broth made from whatever the kitchen could spare. But they gave something far rarer, presence. In an age where illness was seen as divine trial, to be cared for by another was an act of grace. The hospitals were often crowded, especially during plague years or harsh winters. The smell of sweat, incense, and herbs mingled together. At night, the only sounds were the groans of the sick, and the soft shuffle of footsteps carrying water jugs and linen. And yet, for many, it was a place of peace. Some came not to be cured, but simply to be seen, to die in dignity, surrounded by prayer instead of silence. There's a small record from a hospital in Paris, written by a monk in 1520. He described his daily routine rising before dawn, tending to 20 patients, singing hymns as he washed their faces and changed their bandages. He wrote, "We heal not the body alone, but the soul that trembles within it." It's a line that captures what medicine meant in those halls. Not about pills or surgery, but about comfort. The hospitals of the 1500s were also places of learning. Medical students, still tied to the church, came to observe illness carefully, respectfully. They watched, they took notes, and they learned not only anatomy, but humanity. There were, of course, challenges. Cleanliness was poor. Diseases spread easily from bed to bed. The air was heavy. The sheets rarely changed. And yet, for all that, it was often the only refuge for the poor and helpless. In many towns, hospitals also sheltered travelers, orphans, and widows with nowhere else to go. They were, in a sense, the first community centers built on compassion, not profit. Some were grand, like the Hotel Dieu in Paris, where up to 1,000 patients might sleep beneath a painted ceiling of angels watching over them. Others were small, a single room, kept by a local priest and a few devoted helpers. In both, the goal was the same, to offer rest in a world that was rarely gentle. If you walked through those halls at night, you might hear a nun humming softly as she worked, her voice blending with the creak of the wooden floor. She might pause beside a patient, wipe his forehead, and whisper, "Peace be with you." That small act, so ordinary, so quiet, was medicine too. Because in a century when most healing was uncertain, kindness was the one cure everyone could afford. Over time, these early hospitals became more organized. Inventories were kept, rules were written, and slowly, a new idea began to take shape, that caring for the sick was not just a religious duty, but a social responsibility. It was a quiet revolution, born not from kings or scholars, but from the gentle persistence of caregivers who refused to turn anyone away. In these dim, candlelit rooms, medicine began to shift from faith to compassion, from charity to structure. The modern hospital, as we know it today, grew from these humble, holy spaces. And perhaps the most beautiful thing of all is that the spirit of those early halls, that soft voice in the dark saying, "You're not alone," still lives on, in every ward, every hospice, every caring hand that reaches out in the night. Next, we'll move from the hospital ward to the birthing room, where midwives and mothers carried the most fragile form of medicine, the courage to bring life into a dangerous world. The world in the 1500s was full of risk, and perhaps nowhere was that risk more sacred or more feared than in childbirth. There were no sterile rooms, no glowing machines, no doctors in white coats, only women gathered in small, dim rooms, working quietly through the night as one of them brought new life into the world. In those moments, medicine belonged not to scholars or priests, but to midwives. They were the quiet keepers of knowledge, the ones who understood the rhythms of a woman's body, the signs of danger, and the fragile dance between life and death. Most had no books. Their learning came from mothers and grandmothers before them, passed down through whispered advice, the feel of a pulse beneath their fingers, the memory of herbs that soothed pain or eased bleeding. When the time came, the midwife would be called. Often she arrived at night, carrying a small bundle, her tools, her linen, her faith. The room would be warm from the hearth, the woman in labor surrounded by other women, her mother, her sister, her neighbors. The midwife would offer comfort, a touch on the hand, a murmur of prayer, sometimes a sip of spiced wine. She would check the baby's position with gentle hands, guide the breathing, and watch, always watch for signs that something was wrong. For childbirth in the 1500s was dangerous. Even the healthiest mothers faced risks, infection, hemorrhage, exhaustion, and when complications came, there were few remedies beyond hope. If the labor stalled, the midwife might use oils or poultices, massage the abdomen, whisper prayers to Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth. Sometimes she would place a charm or relic under the bed, a saint's medal, or a strip of blessed cloth, not out of superstition alone, but from the deep belief that faith and healing walked hand in hand. And yet, for all the pain and peril, these were moments of deep humanity, moments where women were allowed to lead, to heal, to hold power in a world that gave them so little. The midwife was both healer and witness. She was trusted, sometimes feared, and always respected within her community. Her knowledge was intimate, rooted in experience, not authority. But that same knowledge could make her vulnerable, because the 1500s were also the age of suspicion, a time when women who knew too much about herbs or birth were sometimes whispered about, called wise women by some, and witches by others. If a mother or child died in childbirth, and neighbors sought someone to blame, the midwife's name might be spoken in fear. A tragedy could so easily become an accusation. Still, they persisted. Through centuries, through whispers, through tears, they carried the wisdom that kept countless children alive. It's strange to think for every grand physician writing books in Latin, there were hundreds of midwives working in silence, their skill saving lives one small miracle at a time. They used herbs that worked: pennyroyal for menstrual pain, raspberry leaf for uterine strength, honey and wine for cleansing wounds after birth. And when babies came too early or too weak, they wrapped them in warm cloths and held them to their chest, skin to skin, sharing body heat, long before modern incubators ever existed. After the birth, the mother was not left alone. For weeks she rested in lying-in, surrounded by other women who brought broth, washed her linen, and kept her company. This was healing, too, not just of the body, but of the spirit. Childbirth was both a physical and spiritual event. Priests might bless the newborn within days, while neighbors came with gifts and candles. It was a moment of renewal, a reminder that in a world full of sickness, life still found a way to begin again. And yet, the contrast was constant. The same hands that caught a newborn's first breath might later prepare its small body for burial. Mortality was a companion, never far from the cradle. But perhaps that's what made these women, the midwives, the mothers, so extraordinary. They worked between two worlds, life and death, earth and spirit, and somehow they kept faith in both. There's a record from London, around 1565, of a midwife named Alice Dennis. She attended the births of over 200 children in her parish, and her notes, simple, careful, listed each child's name, the mother's condition, and sometimes a short blessing. Born safe. May he grow strong. The mother, tired but smiling. No fame, no fortune, just quiet service, written in fading ink. But through such hands, the human story continued. Today, when we step into modern delivery rooms with monitors and masks and machines, the echoes of those women are still there in every gentle instruction, every reassuring voice that says, "You're doing beautifully." Because medicine, at its heart, has always been about that moment. The moment when a life begins, and someone is there to hold it steady. And so, from the pain of birth, we move to the beauty of knowledge, to the men and women who began to question, to dissect, to seek the secrets hidden inside the body itself. By the middle of the 1500s, Europe was waking up, not just politically or artistically, but intellectually. The old certainties of the medieval world were beginning to crack, and through those cracks, light began to shine. It was the Renaissance, a time when scholars looked at the heavens, the earth, and finally, themselves, with new eyes. Medicine, too, was changing. Slowly, carefully, but undeniably. Imagine stepping into one of the great medical universities of the time. Padua, Bologna, Paris. Stone walls echoing with the sound of Latin lectures. Students in dark robes leaning over their notebooks, copying words from a professor who quoted the ancients. Their books were precious, each one hand-copied or newly printed on the press. The ink still smelling faintly of oil and metal, but something was shifting. For centuries, doctors had trusted the words of Galen, a Greek physician from over 1,000 years before. To question him was almost unthinkable, yet a few bold minds began to do exactly that. One of them was Andreas Vesalius, a young man from Brussels, who studied medicine in Paris, and found himself frustrated by what he was being taught. The anatomy lessons of the time were peculiar. Professors would sit high above the students, reading aloud from Galen's ancient texts. Meanwhile, a barber surgeon below would dissect a body, but only to illustrate what was being read. If the body didn't match the book, the body was said to be wrong. Vesalius couldn't accept that. He wanted to see for himself, to touch, to examine, to understand. A quiet, reverent chord, a spark of rebellion. So he began dissecting human bodies, first in secret, then as a professor at the University of Padua. And what he found didn't match Galen at all. Galen, after all, had mostly dissected animals. His anatomy, brilliant though it was filled with errors when applied to people. Vesalius wrote down his discoveries, painstakingly, with precise detail. In 1543, he published a great book, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, The Fabric of the Human Body. It was a marvel, 7 volumes, filled with woodcut illustrations so detailed they looked like living art. Muscles layered like draped silk, bones drawn with reverence, each organ labeled with care. For the first time, Europe saw the human body not as a mystery of faith, but as a structure that could be studied, mapped, understood. Students gathered around the pages, eyes wide, whispering in awe. Here was the future printed on parchment, and Vesalius was not alone. Across Europe, a new kind of thinker was emerging, physicians who balanced faith with observation. Men like a fiery Swiss doctor who carried a sword and a stubborn sense of purpose. Paracelsus believed medicine had become too fancy, too trapped in ancient books. He wanted doctors to go out into the fields, to study minerals, plants, poisons, to learn from nature directly. He even burned a copy of Galen's works, right in front of his students. It was a pretty dramatic way to make a point. Soft laugh, gentle tone. But for all his eccentricity, Paracelsus changed things. He was among the first to suggest that diseases might come from outside the body, not from imbalances within, but from toxins or particles, ideas that would, centuries later, lead to the discovery of germs. He used chemistry, what he called alchemy, to create medicines. He studied metals like mercury and antimony, experimented with dosages, and introduced the idea that a substance could be poison or cure, depending on how it was used. The dose makes the poison, he said, and the truth of that still holds today. Then there was Ambroise Père, a humble French barber surgeon who served on battlefields, while others cauterized wounds with boiling oil. A horrifyingly painful method. Père ran out of oil one day and decided to try something different, a mixture of egg yolk, rose oil, and turpentine. The next morning, he found his patients who had received the ointment were calm and healing well, while those burned by oil suffered terribly. From that moment, he changed his ways. Père went on to revolutionize surgery, inventing new methods for tying blood vessels, designing prosthetics, and treating his patients with compassion and gentleness. He famously said, "I dressed him, and God healed him." Simple, humble, true, quiet background, flickering light, gentle page-turning. And so, through the 1500s, medicine began its slow transformation, still clinging to the old humors, yes, but also reaching, tentatively, toward observation, toward evidence, toward something like science. In anatomy theaters, students learned by watching dissections, their breath misting in the cold air, candles casting long shadows on the pale figure below. They weren't just memorizing theories anymore, they were learning from the body itself. Each cut, each drawing, each careful note was an act of courage, a quiet defiance of the unknown. So when we think of the Renaissance, we often picture paintings in cathedrals, sculptors and scholars, but in quiet corners of Europe, another kind of art was unfolding, the art of understanding what it means to live, to breathe, to be made of flesh and bone. And through it all, the candle of curiosity burned brighter. Next, we'll follow that candle deeper still, into the very chambers of the human form, where bone meets muscle, and wonder meets knowledge. Imagine a small theater, circular, tiered, steep. The benches creak softly as students settle in, their robes brushing against wood, their breath visible in the chilly air. At the center lies a wooden table, on it a shape covered in linen, a human form still silent, waiting to teach. This is the anatomy theater, a place both sacred and unsettling, where life and death meet in quiet conversation. It's the mid-1500s, and for the first time, students and scholars gather not to read about the body, but to see it for themselves. At the front stands the anatomist, part scholar, part showman. He holds a scalpel in his hand, a thin, shining sliver of steel, and as he speaks, his voice echoes off the stone. Observe closely, he might say, for nature is the truest text of all. Then, with careful precision, he begins the dissection. The students lean forward, notebooks open, trying not to flinch as the layers are revealed. Skin, muscle, sinew, bone, each one described with wonder, each structure compared to drawings from Vesalius Fabrica, which many hold open on their laps. The air smells faintly of herbs, rosemary or myrrh, sometimes burned to mask the scent of decay. A clerk stands nearby, recording each observation, each whispered theory. And through it all, the tone remains strangely peaceful. For what they are witnessing is not just death, but knowledge. For centuries, the body had been a mystery cloaked in superstition. The church forbade dissections for much of the Middle Ages, seeing the body as too sacred to touch. But in the Renaissance, curiosity found a way. Permissions were granted, often for the bodies of criminals or the unclaimed. And so, slowly, the map of the human form was redrawn, not by faith, but by sight. Each discovery felt like uncovering a secret. Here was the heart, not as a vessel of love, but as a muscle, strong, steady, and vital. Here were the lungs, spongy and light, filling and emptying with air like the bellows of a forge. The liver, the stomach, the brain, all carefully examined, all drawn with reverence. Artists and scientists began to work together. Men like Leonardo da Vinci, whose notebooks from the early 1500s show breathtaking sketches of the body, bones drawn like cathedral arches, muscles mapped like rivers. He studied corpses in secret, working through the night with candle and ink, his curiosity both fearless and poetic. His drawings were so detailed that even centuries later they astonish modern anatomists. And yet, Leonardo was not alone. Everywhere, the Renaissance spirit whispered the same idea. Look closer. This new way of seeing changed everything. It changed how physicians understood illness. It changed how surgeons approached the body. And perhaps most importantly, it changed how people thought about being human. No longer was the body a vessel of sin or punishment. It was a marvel, a design so intricate, so balanced, that even the smallest vein seemed to hold meaning. Dissections, once met with horror, became lessons in humility. Each cut revealed both the fragility and the strength of life. Imagine the hush in that room, as the anatomist revealed the beating heart of creation, not through faith, but through flesh. Students would leave those lectures changed, eyes wide, minds open, their understanding of medicine forever altered. And from those lessons, new ideas began to bloom. Surgeons learned where arteries ran. Physicians began to map organs with greater accuracy. Artists painted with a realism that startled the world. Even the way people prayed began to shift. For how could you not see divine craftsmanship in the way a hand moves, or a heart beats, or breath flows through lungs? This was the moment when medicine crossed a quiet threshold, from guessing to knowing, from reciting to observing. And it's humbling, really, to think that all of modern medicine, every stethoscope, every scan, every cure, began in a cold stone room where a few brave scholars gathered around a single candle and chose to look closer. When the dissection was done, the students would rise in silence. The body, once a mystery, was covered again with linen. The anatomist might close with a prayer, thanking the spirit of the departed for the gift of their body, a final act of generosity in death. Then the candles would be snuffed, one by one, until only the faint scent of wax remained. And in that darkness, the flame of knowledge would continue to burn, small, steady, and eternal. Next time, we'll step away from the scholars' benches and back into the warm kitchens and small cottages of ordinary life. We'll see what healing looked like for the common folk, with their herbs, charms, and whispered prayers. Not everyone in the 1500s could afford a physician. In truth, most people never even saw one. Doctors, after all, were expensive, their Latin words heavy, their hands perfumed with ink and pride. But for the farmer, the weaver, the fisherman, medicine was found closer to home. It lived in the kitchen garden, in the cupboards, in the whispered wisdom passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, a sprig of sage for a sore throat, a warm poultice of onions for a chest cold, a sip of honey and vinegar for a cough that wouldn't leave. This was medicine for the everyday, gentle, practical, and deeply human. Imagine an old cottage at dusk. The air smells of wood smoke and rosemary. A woman stirs a pot over the fire, mixing herbs into a thick, sweet syrup. On the table beside her, a child coughs softly, watching with drowsy eyes. The woman hums as she works. No medical degree, no instruments, just faith in her craft and love for the one she's healing. For centuries, the heart of medicine was love, a kind of care that couldn't be bottled or prescribed. Many of these remedies came from plants long known to heal: chamomile for calming the stomach, comfrey for mending bruises, willow bark for fever and pain, the quiet ancestor of what we now know as aspirin. Herbal medicine was an art of patience. Healers would gather their plants by moonlight, believing certain times of year gave stronger potency. Roots dug in autumn, leaves picked at dawn, flowers dried in bundles hung from rafters. They might crush the herbs with a mortar and pestle, soak them in wine or vinegar, and let them rest in sunlight to draw out their strength. No two mixtures were ever quite the same. Each batch carried a bit of the healer's touch, a bit of their hope. Of course, not all cures worked. Some were strange, even dangerous. A bit of toad powder for infection, a touch of mercury for cleansing. But in a world without modern science, people used what they had, and what their hearts told them might help. Faith and folklore intertwined easily. A charm might hang above a sickbed, a small cross, a bit of red thread, a coin blessed by a priest. It wasn't magic so much as reassurance. Sometimes belief was medicine enough. There was even a cure for melancholy, what we might call sadness or depression today. It might involve listening to soft music, smelling lavender, and taking long walks near running water, which, honestly, doesn't sound so bad, even now. And then there were the traveling healers. They went from town to town with bags full of tonics and stories. Some were charlatans, selling snake oil before the term existed, but others genuinely helped, offering simple comfort to people who had little else. They'd arrive at the village fair with bottles and promises, elixirs for youth, powders for love, potions for courage. People gathered, half skeptical, half hopeful, because hope, too, was part of the cure. In truth, healing in the 1500s was as much about comfort as it was about cure. A mother's hand on a fevered forehead, a neighbor sitting by your bed with a candle, soup brought from next door when you couldn't rise. Those small gestures carried their own kind of medicine. And perhaps that's something we've never really lost, or shouldn't. Even amid superstition and guesswork, there was a deep wisdom here. People understood that illness wasn't just physical, it was emotional, social, spiritual. You couldn't heal the body without caring for the person inside it. And maybe that's why so many of these old remedies survive. We still drink herbal teas for comfort. We still wrap in blankets when we're sick. We still reach for warmth, softness, and rest. Those ancient habits, they linger like old friends. And in the quiet corners of Europe, as the world of science began to stir awake, these humble healers carried on. While scholars drew diagrams of muscles and veins, the people tended to each other with herbs, with touch, with faith. So if you picture medicine in the 1500s, don't only think of plague doctors and anatomy theaters. Think of small cottages filled with the smell of thyme, of mothers stirring broth by firelight, of the soft murmur of comfort spoken in the dark. Because long before we had hospitals, we had homes. And sometimes, healing begins right there, with a whisper, a cup of tea, and someone who cares enough to stay. Next, as the embers die down, we'll step into our final chapter, a reflection on everything the 1500s left behind. The strange, the wise, the hopeful, all leading us toward the dawn of modern medicine. Chapter 15. From superstition to science, a gentle awakening. The 1500s began in shadow. It was a century of bloodletting, leeches, and charms whispered under the breath. A time when illness was seen as divine punishment, and health, a fragile gift from God. But by the century's end, something had changed. The world, for the first time in centuries, began to believe that perhaps illness was not punishment at all, but a puzzle, something that could be studied, understood, and, with enough care, maybe even cured. It wasn't a revolution made in a single night. It was a slow awakening, the kind that begins not with thunder, but with light creeping through curtains at dawn. Doctors began to question old authorities. They stopped relying only on Galen and Hippocrates, and started trusting their own eyes, their own hands. Anatomists began dissecting more bodies, drawing what they saw instead of what they were told to see. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci sketched muscles and bones with breathtaking precision, turning the human body into both art and knowledge. In 1543, a man named Andreas Vesalius published a book called De Humani Corporis Fabrica, the fabric of the human body. It was unlike anything the world had seen before. His drawings were detailed, accurate, and painfully beautiful. The human form laid bare, not as a vessel for sin, but as a masterpiece of structure and design. Vesalius had done something quietly radical. He'd told the truth, not the comfortable truth of tradition, but the real one, drawn from what lay before him. It was the beginning of modern anatomy. Elsewhere, physicians started recording their observations, comparing cases, testing treatments, small steps toward the scientific method. In universities from Padua to Paris, students argued, dissected, debated, hungry to see the world, not as priests described it, but as it truly was. The Renaissance had opened the mind, and medicine was finally catching up. But even as science blossomed, the old ways didn't vanish overnight. Faith and folklore still had their place. A doctor might carry both a scalpel and a prayer. A herbalist might learn from a book one day, and from her grandmother the next. For a time, both worlds coexisted, superstition and science, hand in hand, each trying to comfort the sick in their own way. And maybe that was never really a contradiction, for while science could explain how a fever burns, faith could remind you why it mattered to survive it. This delicate balance between reason and hope, between medicine and mercy, is what carried humanity forward. As the century turned, the seeds of modern medicine had already been planted. Hospitals became more organized. Surgeons began to specialize. And though antiseptics and anesthesia were still centuries away, the idea that the body could be understood and healed was no longer fantasy. The darkness was thinning, and through it, the light of discovery spread, slowly, tenderly, like dawn breaking across the world. So, what did medicine look like in the 1500s? It was brutal, beautiful, and bewildering all at once. It was a world where a surgeon might cut with one hand and cross himself with the other, where a priest blessed your soul while a barber stitched your flesh, where herbs and prayers sat side by side on the same bedside table. And yet, through that strange mix of hope and horror, humanity learned. They learned to question, to observe, to trust their senses more than superstition. They learned that the body was not a mystery meant to be feared, but a story meant to be read. Every leech, every poultice, every prayer was a step, however small, toward understanding what it means to heal. The 1500s did not cure the world, but they set it on the path to try. And in that, perhaps, there is something quietly noble. So tonight, as you drift to sleep, imagine those candlelit rooms of long ago, the scent of herbs and ink, the whisper of prayers, the soft heartbeat of discovery beginning to stir. From superstition to science, from darkness to dawn, the journey of medicine, like the story of humanity itself, has always been one of faith, curiosity, and care. Medicine in the 1500s reminds us that even in the most uncertain times, we never stop trying to heal, to understand, to help, to care. And maybe that's what truly makes us human. And now, as the long night draws to an end, the candle burns low. The healer wipes their hands, the patient breathes a little easier, and outside, the sky begins to lighten. The century of the 1500s was far from gentle, but it was human. It was the century where people dared to wonder why we hurt and how we might heal. They didn't have microscopes, or antibiotics, or anesthesia, but they had patience, and faith, and a strange, relentless curiosity about the fragile machinery of the human body. They looked to the stars for guidance, to the earth for remedies, and to each other for comfort. They made mistakes, many of them painful, even fatal. But through those mistakes, they found new truths. That the body could be mapped, that disease could be studied, that health was not just a miracle, but a mystery waiting to be understood. And every small discovery, every brave experiment, every whispered observation was a flicker of light in the long, dark corridor of time. The 1500s didn't give us modern medicine, but it gave us something better, the courage to search for it. And so, the candle is blown out. The sick room falls silent. The healer closes their worn book of recipes and prayers. Outside, the world keeps turning. Somewhere, a university bell rings. Somewhere else, a child laughs. The world is still full of life, and still learning how to care for it. Medicine would go on to change, to grow sharper, cleaner, wiser, but it would never again forget what those early centuries taught it, that healing is not only found in knowledge, but in kindness, not only in tools, but in touch, not only in facts, but in faith. Faith that even when the world hurts, it can still be made whole again. So as you close your eyes tonight and drift into dreams, remember that for every medicine bottle on your shelf, for every clean hospital room, for every doctor's steady hand, there were centuries of fumbling, of failure, of hope. And behind all of it, the same simple wish to help. From the candlelit rooms of the 1500s to the quiet hum of a modern clinic, the story of medicine has always been a story of care, of people helping people in whatever way they can. And maybe that's all medicine really is. Good night, sleep well, and may you wake rested and whole in a world that keeps learning how to heal.